correct answer is they hunted for a long time before they ever came back to a settlement. Sometimes 2 months, sometimes 3 months. In the case of some of the most famous long hunters, a year or more. Can any of you name someone who might have been considered a long hunter 200, 250 years ago? Native Americans were certainly long hunters, but they were short hunters too, because sometimes they would only venture just as far outside of camp as they needed in order to collect their game. The long hunters went out purposely for a long time. Who might have been a long hunter that you've ever heard? Thinking more along the lines of Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Simon Kenton. These are the names of some of the most famous long hunters. And they would go out for as long as a year at a time. When they finally did come back into the settlements, and which were relatively primitive housing communities on the frontier, they would sometimes have huge piles of animal skins called hides. Mostly deer skins. 100, 150, maybe 200 deer skins would be loaded onto a pack horse and brought back in from the forest. They might have made some of their own clothing out of a few of the skins, but there was a more important purpose for them bringing back all of those skins. They used them in place of money. Money, as we know it today, was very scarce on the American frontier. We're talking about the edge of what we would call civilization is the frontier. Where civilization ends and the wilderness begins, that's referred to as the frontier. And when you get out that far, coming back to the settlements was a very important thing, because much of the material you had with you could only be obtained from settlements. For example, the gunpowder that they needed to power their rifles. They could not make gunpowder, not in the forest. They would have to come back into a community to get their gunpowder. Metal goods. What little metal goods they did have. For example, this is a Pennsylvania Flintlock rifle. This part of the mechanism is called the lock, and it's made of metal. If they were to break a piece of this, chances are they would not be able to repair it unless they came back to the settlement. When they came back to the settlement, they needed something to trade for their repairs or to buy new materials, and what they would use would be animal hides. Specifically deer hide, bear hide, elk, and moose. Those were the most important ones. Later on, beaver became a very important commodity, but for the early long hunter, the deer, the elk, the moose, which are all members of the same family, they're all members of the deer family, and bear were the most important hides to come back with. Now, you're already familiar with a couple of terms that reflect the long hunter and his animal skins. What's another name for a male deer? A buck. What do we call a dollar bill sometimes?
A buck.
A buck. You suppose there's a connection? Yes, there is. The connection is the term buck as we use it today to mean money was originally buck skin. Now, what is a doe? Do you have any doe? The term doe was not the doe like in bred doe, it was D-O-E, the female deer. So when we talk about buck and doe, when it comes to money, that's what the long hunter was referring to when he had to come into the settlement to buy things. He had so many bucks on the back of his pack horse. So many bucks meaning so many hides of the male deer. Or he might have some bucks and some doe. Now, if he was a good hunter, he would try to always harvest just the bucks because they were worth more than the doe skins. Do you know why? Can you think of why?
Because the bucks are bigger?
Yes, exactly. The buckskin is bigger by about 2 to 2.5 square feet, which is a good sizable piece of hide. Those hides were eventually going to become leather to make things like moccasins, belts, hunting pouches, hat bands. These were some of the things that would eventually be made by people in towns out of the leather coming from the hides. And of course, if you had a buckskin, you had more leather available than if you had a doe skin. So bucks were actually worth more than the doe skins. Now, some of the things I have on were characteristic of the long hunter. The long hunter often wore what was called a felt flop hat or floppy hat. It was only called that, I believe, because when it got kind of damp, I think it used to flop a little bit in their eyes. But it was a very important tool because this would shade them. It would keep things off of their body, like, you know, some gnats and things of that nature, and they could decorate it any way they wanted. It wasn't a fancy hat, and it wasn't an expensive one, but it was one of the tools that they had available to them. A hat can be a tool. They would carry a hunting pouch. In this case, my pouch is made of a soft cowhide rather than a deer hide. Inside of this pouch is everything that I need to take care of my rifle and to take care of me. I have a fire starting kit inside of this pouch, so that when I needed to start a campfire, I had the materials there for it. The tools that are needed to take care of my gun, should I have a loose part, should a screw come a little bit loose, should I need to replace the flint, which is this little stone inside of the lock mechanism, I have the tools for that. I also have a cover, which covers the lock. It's called the cow's knee, strangely enough, and it's a piece of leather that fits over my lock so that in wet weather, during a rainstorm, I can keep my powder dry by covering it. So this pouch is I even have a primitive fishing kit in here. Just a few hooks and some line and a little cork stopper, but cut a branch, tie the line to the branch, put a hook on the end of the line, and what do you have? Fishing pole, fishing rod. You didn't have to carry a fancy fishing rod with you because you could get one from the forest and just tie your material to it and fish in your streams. So that everything in this pouch was of necessity. The Longhunter did not carry anything that he didn't absolutely have to have because, of course, weight would be a problem. Even if you had a horse to carry you and some of your gear, weight is still always a problem. Now, on my hip, you see what people would commonly call an axe, but this is not an axe. This is a tomahawk. And the term tomahawk is actually comes from the Native American language. But it differs from an axe in one basic way. This is not a pounding tool, this is a cutting tool. Axes normally have a flat end on the back, which is very heavy metal, that can be used for pounding stakes into the ground, pounding nails into boards. This, as you can see, does not have that thick back end. You may have an axe at home or a hatchet at home that has a big squared off end. The blade might look like this, but the back end does not. Also, the handle of my tomahawk is rather narrow. Unlike an axe that's used for heavy pounding, this is used for light camp work, trimming stakes for a tent perhaps, cutting branches that might be in your way when you were doing something. This is also used in dressing out animals. When you had to remove some of the parts of an animal that were very tough, like bone, this would be used to chop through it. And finally, in the case of defense, this could be used as a weapon as well. This can be thrown, or it can be used as you would use any kind of a stick or a club in your hand, as a club or as a sharp, penetrating object. And on my opposite hip, I have a butcher knife. One of the most important tools that the Longhunter could have would be his butcher knife. As you can see, it is very large. It is rather hefty. The reason for that, it is used for everything, from cutting one's food for dinner to chopping branches that are in your way, or to trimming off the hair from the hide of an animal you've harvested. It's an all-purpose tool. These are some of the things of the Longhunter. His rifle, a flintlock, his knife, his tomahawk, his hunting pouch, his floppy hat or flop hat, and his footwear, which were primarily leather moccasins. Mine are made of leather. These can be repaired, or a whole new pair can be made in the forest with some of the hides that you might have strapped to the back of your horse. So it was a very practical thing to wear moccasins, even though some people said it was just a fancy way of going barefoot, because they are not waterproof. They are water repellent, but you do soak through, and if you get wet feet, you're slopping around in wet, cold moccasins. But, again, repair was relatively simple. A needle and thread was all you needed, and a knife to cut new leather. That's about all you needed. In the back. This right here, powder horn. This is what I would carry my gunpowder in. It is empty right now, as you can see, nothing comes out, because we don't carry gunpowder unless we're actually going to be using the gun for shooting purposes. It's much safer to go with an empty powder horn than to travel around with one that's full of half a pound of black powder, which is very explosive. One more question and we'll be moving on.
Is that a real gun?
Is it a real gun?
Yes.
Absolutely. This is a Pennsylvania Flintlock, long rifle Flintlock. The loading process is relatively tedious, meaning it takes quite a while to do and you have to do it with some care, but I'll give you a quick description of what you would do. I have in my pouch a measuring device, a little brass tube that holds the exact amount of powder, black gunpowder, that I need to fire one shot from this rifle. I would take my powder measure and I would fill it right to the brim with powder from my powder horn, replacing the stopper firmly in the powder horn so that no powder can fall out accidentally while I'm doing the rest of the loading process. I would then take my loading tool, my measuring device, and I'd pour the powder directly down the barrel, and then I would tap the gun a few times on the ground to settle the powder. Now at that time, the powder is way down here in this section of the barrel. The next step would be to ram a ball. Now balls were the lead objects that were used as a projectile. In this piece of deer antler, I have 2 lead balls that are already prepared for loading. They are wrapped in a piece of linen called a patch. In order to load the ball, I must first of all remove my ramrod. Because of a ceiling problem, I have to slant my gun. I put one of the balls directly over the hole in the top of the barrel, and I would ram that ball all the way down until it was right on top of the powder down here. And I would ram it as tightly as I could, because the tighter the ball is against the powder, the faster that ball will travel out when the powder finally explodes. Next step, so that I never lose my ramrod, I immediately return the ramrod to its position in the rifle. These are called thimbles. The ramrod goes back into the thimbles so you don't ever lose it. Because should you lose one of these in the forest, finding another stick of suitable length and of the proper diameter, that's straight, it's going to be pretty difficult. Now I have got a patched ball in my barrel sitting on top of powder. Next step, because this is a flintlock, I have to now prepare the lock area of the flint. This is referred to as a cock, and in it you see a piece of whitish stone. That is a piece of flint, a very, very hard stone. When flint strikes steel, it produces sparks, and that's the key to firing this particular weapon. I would then place the cock on a half-cock position. I would then take a little more powder and I would drop it into a groove that is right below the jaws of the cock. That's called the pan. Once the pan had had a little sprinkle of powder in it, I would then close this part of the lock called a frizzen, and now I am ready to fire. The last step would be to pull the jaws back to the full cock position. Now if you touch the trigger, it goes kaboom. There is no powder in this gun, no explosion will happen, but I'll show you what it sounds like when you squeeze the trigger. Nope, there's not going to be any sound. You're going to hear something that goes clatch. Watch. See the spark? That's all you needed to light the powder in the pan. There is a hole between the pan and the barrel. That flame from that burning powder would go through the hole, touch off the main charge of powder, and out of the end would come a half-inch sized piece of lead traveling at about 1,500 feet per second.